Hello, today we're going to talk about some of my favorite troubleshooting tips for pointed pen calligraphy. I get asked almost every day for some different tips on how to deal with issues that come up in day-to-day calligraphy practice and basic overall jobs that other calligraphers might be working on. When you're just getting started, you might not know how to troubleshoot some common issues that arise, so I want to talk you through some of my methods on how I deal with problems that come up when I'm practicing my calligraphy. The first tip I want to talk about is one of the most common questions I get, and that is, how do I write for so long without having to re-dip my nib into the ink? And a lot of that comes from personal experience, knowing the pressure of my own hand and just practicing over the years. But it also comes from knowing how much of my nib to actually dip into the ink. So when you dip your nib in the ink, you want to make sure that you're fully covering your vent. So you want to look at what you're doing and you want to make sure the nib is completely covered in ink when you pull it out. If you can see that the vent is not covered, then you haven't dipped far enough into the ink and you want to re-dip. If it looks like you have too much ink on your nib, then you would just wipe it off. But making sure that you have enough ink on your nib is going to make it so you can write longer without having to re-dip. So my second tip is, what do you do when the ink won't stick to the nib? And usually this happens when your nib is brand new and it hasn't been prepped. So on the more chrome coated nibs like the Nico or the Zebra G, they require more prepping than a nib that isn't coated in chrome, but all nibs must be prepped before you go to write with them. So when a nib comes fresh from the manufacturer, it has a slick oil coating on it to prevent oxidization and damage to the nib when it's being shipped from the manufacturer to the seller to you. And if you don't remove that slick coating, the ink will not stick to the nib. It will raise up, it will bead up on the nib, and you won't be able to write very much without having to re-dip. So as soon as you get a new nib into your pen holder, you're going to want to prep it. So let's talk about different ways to prep your nib. There are many different ways to prep your nib, and everyone has their own personal preference. So you can use rubbing alcohol, you can put a little bit of toothpaste on your nib and rub off that slick oil coating. You can stick your nib in a potato, but I mean, who has a potato sitting on their desk every day when they go to start working? You can run a flame under your nib to just kind of burn off that slick oil coating. I like to do what's easiest, and basically that's use what is at my desk, which is the ink. So when I go to prep my nib, all I do is dip my nib into the ink I'm going to be using and immediately wipe it off. And sometimes I'll do it again, but usually that's enough to just remove that slick oil coating right off the nib, and then you can start working. For a third tip, I want to talk about ink bleeding. So ink bleeding is a fairly common issue that comes up when you're a new calligrapher, or even if you're not a new calligrapher, you might not realize that not all your tools are going to work well together. So typically if your ink is bleeding, it's one of two things. It's either the paper or it's the ink. So either the paper isn't high enough quality or the ink is too thin for the paper that you have. So let's say it's not high enough quality. What you want to know is that you can't just pull out any type of paper and start writing on it, especially with calligraphy ink. So you want to make sure that your paper is pretty substantial, usually 24 pound or 32 pound text weight paper will work okay. But if you're not sure, check the link below. We've linked to all the pads in our shop, which are made of calligraphy quality paper. The other thing is the ink. So if your ink isn't thick enough, it will just bleed out into the paper. It won't sit on the paper. It just sinks in and bleeds out, and it looks messy, and you know that it could look better, and it's bothersome. So what you want to do is thicken your ink. So to thicken your ink, if you've determined the problem is the ink, you're going to want to take a separate jar and pour a little bit of the ink that you already are using into that jar, leaving some room to add your ink thickener. You'll add a few drops of ink thickener and then put the lid back on and mix it up, get it evenly distributed, and then test it out and see if it works on the paper that you're using. If it is still too thin, you'll notice that it's still bleeding. If it's so thick that it won't come off your nib, then you need to add a little bit more ink back into the mixture. You put too much ink thickener in. There's no exact ratio, it's just kind of, you'll get used to it over time, but this is just a quick way to thicken up the ink that you have on hand if it doesn't work with the paper that you need to use. If you're not sure what ink thickener to use, we have some in our shop. It's compatible with all the inks we sell in our shop, so I'll link to that below. Another very common issue I see coming up all the time is when the ink won't flow off your nib and you can see that your nib has ink on it. So why is that happening? Usually this happens if you allow ink to dry on your nib. So you never want to allow ink to dry on your nib. You always want to keep a clean nib, so you would need to wipe it off with a paper towel constantly while you're working and never put the nib down with ink drying on it. So if there is dry ink blocking the tip of the nib, it won't allow wet ink to flow out. So in order to take care of that, you're going to want to either wipe it off as you're working, or if you can tell that you have plenty of wet ink, you might just want to give your nib a few short downstroke pulls off to the side of whatever you're working on. If you're working on someone's envelopes, do it on a piece of scrap paper. If doing little pulls or jiggles with the tip of the nib doesn't work to get that ink flowing out again, then just wipe the nib off completely and re-dip it back into the ink. But the key is to get in the habit of not allowing ink to dry on your nib. I hope you've enjoyed part 1 of our troubleshooting tips. We have more tips for you next week, so be sure to check back for part 2 of our troubleshooting for pointed pen calligraphy. And as usual, be sure to check out the links below for all the resources and tools that I mentioned in this video. Thanks!